All right, welcome to part 5 of Securing the Republic. This is a continuation of the War of 1812. This is part 2. Now, the battle on the land in Canada especially was a disaster, and the war on sea, well, it's not going to be great either, but there were some at least notable individual ship-to-ship victories for the United States, right? But ultimately, you're looking at the Royal Navy versus the small United States Navy. But for example, the USS Constitution is going to fight and win 2 significant naval battles. One against the HMS Gruyere, and the other one against the HMS Java. Right. The ship got its nickname Old Ironsides as a result of this. Cannonballs literally bouncing off the side of the ship. And an interesting side note, the USS Constitution is the only U.S. naval vessel today that is still part of the active roster, because it is still in the active naval roster, that has been involved in ship-to-ship combat. Every other current U.S. Navy ship has never been involved in ship-to-ship combat. Right? The aircraft carriers use the aircraft to do it. Okay? But like I said, ultimately Britain is going to maintain overall control of the seas, and so that means they can pretty much do whatever they want. The British control of the seas is going to ultimately lead to the burning of the nation's capital itself. On August 19, 1814, the British are going to land troops at a place called Benedict, Maryland, right? And it's going to be under the command of Major General Robert Ross. These troops will then begin marching towards Washington, D.C. itself. They're going to face a ragtag militia at a place called Bladensburg, right? Now, the American forces there at Bladensburg will hold off the British advance for a short time, but ultimately will have to fall back. James Madison himself, President Madison, will be present on the battlefield at the time, and it'll be one of only 2 times in American history that you're going to have the President of the United States actually present on an active battlefield, right, at a time of war. The only other time is going to be arguably the placement of Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War on some of the times when the Confederate troops were relatively close to Washington, D.C. Okay. Madison's going to have to withdraw into Washington, D.C. There, he's going to find his wife, Dolly, has already been preparing for an evacuation of the city. She is famously going to save the famous portrait of George Washington. Also, she's going to stuff much of the White House silver into her dress. A lot of the papers are going to be gathered up, and James and Dolly Madison are going to escape the city. The British will enter the city on the 24th of August. They will enter the White House. They'll dine on effectively the leftovers in the building, and then they're going to set the White House on fire. They're also going to set the Capitol building on fire and many other buildings inside of Washington, D.C. Right? This is one of 3 times that the White House has been exposed to a rather major fire. This is, of course, being the most severe. The White House was effectively gutted. Fortunately, though, this time, this White House burning, the actual architect, James Hoban, the architect of the White House, was still alive, and he'll lead the effort to rebuild the White House, and the White House will be restored by 1817. The same year that Washington was attacked and burned, you're going to have American negotiators trying to negotiate a settlement in Ghent in Belgium, a settlement to end the war. The delegation that Madison sends over there is kind of an all-star cast of people. You're going to have John Quincy Adams, who at the time was the U.S. Minister to Russia. He's going to be the chief negotiator. He's also effectively interviewing for his future role as Secretary of State under James Monroe's administration, right? Henry Clay, the war hawk, will be there. Some other names that probably not as notable, but at least were important there at that time. You're going to have Albert Gallatin, who was the Secretary of the Treasury. He'll be present. You'll have James A. Bayard, who's going to be a moderate Federalist, who will also be part of the negotiations. And Jonathan Russell, who was the charge d'affaires in Paris itself. He was basically the minister to Paris. Okay, will be present there in Ghent, negotiating the treaty. Ultimately, what is negotiated and settled on is going to restore what we'll call the status quo ante bellum, right? It'll be signed on Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1814, and it's going to literally return things back to the way it was before the war. The treaty states that all territories, places, and possessions whatsoever taken by either party from the other during the war, or which may be taken after the signing of this treaty, except only the islands herein mentioned, shall be restored without delay. There's a few islands that changed hands, and that was it. Everything was returned the way it was before the war had actually started. So the question then becomes, who won the war, right? It's often portrayed as an American victory. Well, I mean, I always take a look at, when I look at the wars and who the victors are, I take a look at war objectives. For the United States, the war objectives were conquer Canada, end British impressment. Neither one of these war objectives were obtained. The invasion of Canada was a disaster, and with the restoration of the status quo ante bellum, that does nothing to address British impressment of American sailors. The British war objectives were quite simpler. It was punish the United States for invading them while they were trying to deal with Napoleon. Right? That is the way that they're going to take a look at it. Okay? But we do tend to portray this as a victory. Now, some of this is because of some pretty memorable symbolism that came out of this. Andrew Jackson, 2 weeks after the war is over, is going to fight a very memorable battle in New Orleans. The British troops attacking New Orleans didn't know the war was over, neither did Jackson, and Jackson is going to win a resounding victory there. This is going to start his stardom rocketing up, which we'll talk about in the next topic. The Francis Scott Key, an attorney, is going to witness the British bombardment of Fort McHenry in Baltimore, and he is going to be so inspired by the flag still remaining waving above the fortification after the failed attempt to attack the city that he's going to write a poem called "The Star" that eventually is going to become our national anthem, "The Star-Spangled Banner." Right? It's our last war with England. After this, we're going to slowly develop a pretty strong relationship with England that still persists to the present day. And admittedly, some historians refer to this war as the Second War of Independence. And when you take a look at it from that perspective, well, then yeah, we won because the British did not recolonize us. But remember, that was not the British war objectives. The British war objectives was to punish the United States, which they did.